What if we could create artificial neurons in Petri dishes that could compute like human brains? Could we then create a new form of intelligence that surpasses human capabilities? This brings us to the following questions. Do brains really compute, and what they compute? What do we mean by computations in the context of biological systems? And how does this compare to artificial systems? What is memory? Can we have biological quantum computer? Let's explore. First, I have finished reading a very fascinating book called Why Brains Cannot Compute by the author Dale Purvis. Hence, the question is, do brains really compute or not? The author argues that brains do not compute in the traditional sense, but rather they process information through complex networks of neurons. This challenges the conventional view that brains function like computers, which operate on binary logic and fixed algorithms. Yet the brain is the most complex organ and efficient processor of information known to us. But this depends on what we mean by information. The modern concept of computing can be seen in the paper of Alan Turing, who defined computations in terms of algorithms and formal systems. This paper formed a turning point in the history of computer science and laid the foundation of modern computing. The idea is that you can carry out computations in a mechanized way. This is visualized through a calculator or calculator machine, which is fed with tape, has a specific instructions written on it. This tape is divided into squares. Each square has a code, instruction written or engraved in binary format on it, in binary strings. Then the tape is fed into the calculator machine, which has a reader to read one square at a time. And based on the instruction it reads, it performs a specific operation. It could be addition, it could be subtraction, and or something similar, and then it moves to the next square. Each square represents one computation, one operation that takes specific time. And this process continues until the entire tape has been read and the computation is complete. In principle, any numerical operation can be implemented via this mechanism. Also, logical operations can be represented numerically. Hence, these machines can theoretically solve any logical problem. Turing machines just illustrate that you can do computations and jump from one point in time to another point in time with a specific result or an output. So you can have an input or an output of an operation. And this gives the definition of an algorithm. An algorithm is a set of instructions implementable in a universal Turing machine. Hence, to go from one value or input to another value, you need an algorithm to describe the path similar to given map to take you from one address or one location to another, like from your home to work. However, not everything is computable, and hence you can find situations or problems where the solution is not computable. Pretending you have an algorithm which describes for you precisely what you need to go from which point to another. However, when it comes to biological systems, it is a different story. The author argues that the brains do not compute in the traditional sense, and instead they process information through complex networks of neurons that communicate via chemical and electrical signals. This is fundamentally different from how computers operate, which rely on binary logic and fixed algorithms, and this opens the realm of what can we actually compute with our brains and potentially paves the way to understand the path to generalized or general artificial intelligence. Let's have the following analogy. Think of a Turing machine like a musician playing from a sheet of music that extends infinitely. The musician reads one note or instruction at a time, plays it, and then looks at the next note to decide what to do next, which string he has or she has to pull, or which key on the piano. If the music sheet is written correctly, or the algorithm, the song, which is a solution, is done perfectly every time. The brain, according to the book, acts more like a jazz musician improvising by ear. They aren't reading a step-by-step script. They are reaching to the moment based on years of practice, remembering which note combinations sounded good, which is the reward, and which sounded bad or error. And based on this experience, the brain will instruct the hands to play. This indicates that the failure of algorithmic computation was in the brain. They do not follow fixed algorithms, but they adapt and learn from experience. Brain are incapable of measuring the physical world with arbitrary precision. Biological sensors are not measuring devices. They do not possess the necessary instruments, such as the rulers or the photometers, to recover the objective properties of the environment. Without this ability to provide specific measurements such as distance, length of a line, or the intensity of light, the brain lacks the foundational data required for algorithmic computations. Why? Because to function algorithmically, a system must be able to take precise measurements of its inputs or objective data and process them according to defined set of axioms or rules to manipulate that data. Further, sensory input presents an inverse problem where it forms a physical barrier from seeing the world directly. The information received by the brain is often incomplete or ambiguous, in a sense that it is a mix or mixes of multiple physical sources combined all together in a single signal, and this makes it impossible to logically disentangle the sources, the specific sources for each signal or of the stimuli. For example, when we see a color, the brain receives light signals that are influenced by various factors such as lighting conditions, surrounding colors, and the object's material properties. The brain cannot directly access the objective color of the object. It only receives a composite signal that needs to be interpreted, and this makes it impossible for the brain to perform precise algorithmic computations based on the objective measurements via the sensory inputs. We come to the motion, for example. The 3D motion of an object involves the speed, direction, and the distance. When projected into the 2D surface of the retina, these factors are mixed. Consequently, the image sequence of the retina cannot specify the actual speed or direction of the object in the real world. The brain would need to work backward from the stimulus to the physical cause. However, because one stimulus maps to many possible causes, this is a mathematically ill-posed or unsolvable problem. It's very challenging. We have also the hidden reality. Since the brain cannot measure the separate physical parameters, it lacks the necessary instruments like the rulers or the photometers. The objective properties of the world would remain hidden. Therefore, the brain possesses nothing to compute. And here it comes the solution. Empirical bypassing, since the brain cannot solve the inverse problem logically, it bypasses it empirically. Instead of trying, it bypasses it empirically. So instead of trying to calculate the correct source of a stimulus, the brain relies on the frequency of the occurrence. It generates perceptions based on what the stimulus has most often signified in the past for the survival of the species and the individual. Take the following analogy. You see the shadow of a rabbit. However, you cannot know logically what created it. You have the shadow. It could be a real rabbit, or it could be a cardboard cut out, or a person using their hands to create the shadow. Because the 3D object is collapsed into a 2D shadow, the information is conflated. And hence we come to the alternative empirical association. With that, the book and us, we can conclude that the brains do not compute in the traditional algorithmic sense. Instead, they process information empirically. Because the brain cannot compute an unsolvable inverse problem, it operates empirically. Instead of calculating what is this object would be, the brain asks what has been the most successful response to this pattern in the past. Hence, the more the brain registers and processes information, the more it can generate successful responses. Empirical ranking is crucial in the brain. It's not math. The brain generates perceptions based on the frequency of occurrence of stimulus patterns experienced by the species and the individual. Also, we have the survival. It's not a truth. It's the survival that happens in the brain. The supervisor of this process is not the programmer or the logical ruler set, but the biological reward of the survival and reproduction. The brain creates association that work for survival. This is regardless of whether they accurately represent the physical geometry or physics of the scene. This is very crucial and explains that why our brains aren't registering the same reality all the time. Take the following analogy. If you were a computer, you would need to measure exactly 200 grams of flour and 150 millimeters of milk to satisfy the algorithm for a pancake recipe. If you had no scale, no sensory tools, and didn't know the density of the white powder, the inverse problem in this case, you literally could not compute the recipe. However, the brain is like a grandmother cooking by feeling. She doesn't measure or compute anything. She simply throws the ingredients into the bowl based on years of trial and error. She knows that how much flour is usually results in a good breakfast or a good pancake. So this is a success or the reward from experience. Even though she has no objective data on the weight or the chemical composition of the ingredients, she isn't calculating, she is relying on empirical history. Now we come to the intelligence. What do we mean by intelligence in this context? Intelligence is difficult to define precisely in either biological or the computational terms. The book argues that the traditional definitions are often misleading, but isn't it? According to the book, humans are poor at logic. Psychological studies show that humans often fail at simple logical tasks, such as recognizing that the product of multiplication sequence is the same regardless of the order of numbers, or solving probability puzzles like the Monty Hall problem. Logic is rare in nature. Problems require the reasoning and logic are relatively rare outside of classrooms or puzzles. Because rationality plays little part in survival and reproduction, biological organisms have not evolved to be logical engines. We have the critique of the special talent definitions. The book criticizes it. The book notes that intelligence is typically used to describe talents that most people lack, such as higher mathematics abilities. The author views this as a definition deficiency, arguing that an accomplished athlete solving complex physical challenges on the playing field is no less intelligent than a math hero. Furthermore, the text dismisses standard metrics like the IQ tests as dubious measures that are heavily biased by social history and economic status. And here it comes as a biological definition. Empirical success, instead of the ability to follow rules or algorithms, the book proposes intelligence should be viewed through the lenses of biological success. The text shows that getting along in the world is not based on rules, even for simple organisms that have succeeded for some time. Like we have now the trial and the error, that intelligence in a biological context is the ability to solve problems using trial and error responses that have proven successful over evolutionary and individual time. This paves the way to the definition of artificial intelligence. So the book acknowledges that artificial intelligence, or AI, it is the use of non-biological neural networks to solve problems. While successful at specific tasks like genes or protein folding, the author argues that this does not necessarily reflect how biological brains operate or explain the phenomenology of biological intelligence. Hence, we can devise some thoughts regarding intelligence and neuron-based computing. There are companies who would like to use real bio-neurons for computations or making processors to train artificial intelligence. Yet, the brain is the most efficient processor on the planet. However, now we need to understand the capabilities of the brain to know what we can do with it. Artificial bioneurons could be used to train AI models more efficiently, leveraging the trial and error and rewarding systems, training using cost functions for neural networks and AI models. However, the idea that to process logical operations with neurons is not feasible in the sense we would imagine it. The logic itself would evolve over time, over many trials and errors across history. This increased after the ability to record, so new brains or students can add and complement the work of the former teachers or workers because of this. But now there is a bit of caveat about such a scheme. We, as biological systems, understand via training our neuron on success patterns, and yet we have already derived many rules and algorithms. How this can even be? Does this contradict the proposition of the book? Take the following examples about understanding classical mechanics. Before it comes with recognizing patterns and a full complete mathematical framework, which you can use device as rulers and so on to drive or compute anything, our brains, before that, can evaluate the speed just via the relation that would make sense, and then use a formula or a simple vision to evaluate it, to quantify it. And through this simple relation, the law of the speed would be derived. And then we can quantify the motion. But this happens before forming the classical mechanics. We only have done this just by studying or by observing successfully what happens, recognizing patterns, and then evaluate the simple relation, and then test the result and find it successful, and hence a formula is being derived or formulated. Hence, our brains basically have established the basic mathematics via trial and error, observations with nature to comprehend nature around us. Then, using the way a rule can succeed or using the way for a rule to succeed to describe nature or not as a trial and error. If we get a success, the rule is established. If not, the formula doesn't work and the rule is failed. Then the accumulation of the success patterns and rules would form a big picture which we can use to devise logic and then the formalism itself of the logic and math. Hence, this ability would make the logic itself starts to grow and produce new things because now we have sufficient pieces and bits to combine and form the big picture. And this started to happen a few centuries ago, where the mathematical theories can make predictions beyond what we could see and observe and open the door for more observations or give better interpretations to the observations which could not be explained with the existed logic. Take, for example, the Earth-centric model and the geometric model of the solar system. Or take, for example, the language of quantum mechanics and the prediction of the standard model to find certain elementary particles, or general relativity to predict certain types of black holes. Hence, we come to the fundamental question: what is the reality of information in the brain? The brain forms a way for us to see the world. We see the world via this sensory. Repeating thoughts might form illusions or rather realities in our brain. Hence, it matters how do we think and how we record the information and the thoughts in our brains. This is related to the evolution of algorithms in brains or the new algorithmic meaning. So we have experience and education which shape perception. For example, listening continuously to podcasts and to audiobooks, reading and learning expand the reservoir of knowledge we have that helps us a lot in shaping our thoughts. Knowledge is like the elements of successful trials and errors made by others or by ourselves about nature, ourselves, and everything around us. Of course, reading about others would give us better ability in recognizing objects, problems, and patterns, and come up with better patterns when identifying objects or solving problems, which could be done similar to other solutions or thinking of new paths and use the trial and error in it. Since this is crucial for creativity, it's our duty to verify what we actually read and understand about reality. It is now in the world where deception and deceiving information is dominant. It's easy to get manipulated while listening to continuous fake news, wrong facts, all of this might build a reality in your brain which would make you see the world from one eye only and ignore other facts. Seeing is believing, and after seeing the world from this specific eye, it would be hard to change this perception. Your thoughts and the core of your mind will be formed out of this. Your brain would have established a specific pattern of thinking, and any new information which contradicts this perception would be very hard to accept. So this is what impacts the algorithms in our brains, how we do computations, or how we think or rationalize the world, the way we think about the reality and about facts around us, the biases and what we call culture, everything. All of that is your augmented reality based on the thoughts that are consolidated in your mind from different sources. So stay creative, stay alert, stay knowledgeable, and take the lead of your brain. Until then, see you.